U.S. history shouldn't feel like a luxury purchase, a guessing game, or a lecture you were never really given. If books are out of budget, you don't know where to start, or your class skipped the good parts, this channel is for you. Here, we take the stories that shaped the United States and make them clear, sourced, and human. We zoom in on people usually left out, set events in context, and show how power works without gatekeeping or jargon. No paywalls, no sponsorships, no monetization. This is a nonprofit space built for learners, not ads. Every episode cites its sources and points you to ways to keep reading. From first contact to Reconstruction, labor strikes to landmark court cases, grassroots movements to presidential decisions, we'll trace what happened, why it mattered, and who paid the price or pushed for change. If you've ever felt behind, you're not. Start anywhere. Ask questions. Disagree respectfully. Learning is the point. Subscribe, comment with what you want covered next, and share this with someone who deserves a better history class. Bacon's Rebellion of 1676 was a violent uprising in colonial Virginia that exposed deep rifts in the colony's social and political order. Often remembered as the first major rebellion in England's American colonies, it has been variously interpreted as a populist revolt against corrupt governance, a conflict fueled by class grievances, and a ruthless campaign against Native Americans. Thomas Jefferson later hailed rebel leader Nathaniel Bacon as a patriot fighting tyranny, reflecting a view that the rebellion prefigured the American Revolution. More recent historical analyses, however, paint a more complex picture. Bacon's rebellion was rooted not in a struggle for liberty from English rule, but in the volatile dynamics of 17th century Virginia, an economy dominated by tobacco, widening inequalities of wealth and land ownership, and simmering tensions on the frontier with native peoples. The rebellion's course, and its aftermath, also had profound implications for the colony's labor system and racial hierarchy, hastening the transition from white indentured servitude to racialized African slavery. This essay will expand upon the historical context and significance of Bacon's rebellion across several dimensions. First, it will examine the economic, political, and social landscape of 17th century Virginia, including the rise of tobacco, the consolidation of land by elites, and the colony's relationship with England. Next, it will profile the two central figures, Nathaniel Bacon and Governor Sir William Berkeley, whose clashing backgrounds and motives shaped the rebellion's character. A deeper exploration of Virginia's evolving race and labor systems will illuminate how the rebellion marked a turning point in the shift from indentured servitude toward chattel slavery. Comparisons with other colonial conflicts and uprisings, such as King Philip's War in New England, Leisler's Rebellion in New York, and the Stono slave revolt in South Carolina, will situate Bacon's rebellion in a broader pattern of unrest in early America. Finally, the perspectives and experiences of the Native American communities caught up in Bacon's rebellion, including the Pamunkey-Dogue and Susquehannock peoples, will be highlighted to underscore the rebellion's devastating impact beyond the English colonial society. These additions, integrated with the narrative of the rebellion itself, will provide a more comprehensive understanding of why Bacon's rebellion unfolded as it did and how it left a lasting legacy on Virginia's trajectory. 17th century Virginia was a colony defined by its tobacco economy and stark social divisions. Ever since John Rolfe's introduction of tobacco cultivation in the early 1600s, the crop had become Virginia's lifeblood, fueling prosperity for some and desperation for others. By mid-century, tobacco was the colony's dominant cash crop and medium of exchange, making Virginia one of England's wealthiest mainland colonies. However, this one-crop dependence also made the colony's fortunes precarious. Tobacco prices rose and fell with global supply and demand, and by the 1670s, Virginians faced an economic crisis due to overproduction and competition. Planters in Maryland and the newly settled Carolinas were also growing tobacco, contributing to a glut in the market. At the same time, England's mercantilist policies, embodied in the Navigation Acts, restricted the colony's trade options, requiring tobacco to be shipped only to England on English ships. These policies raised the cost of manufactured goods and limited buyers for colonial tobacco, worsening Virginia's economic slump. While the Navigation Acts were resented, contemporary accounts suggest that Bacon's followers were even more disturbed by the immediate hardships of falling tobacco prices and high taxes in the 1670s. Declining tobacco prices, largely caused by overplanting, meant small farmers earned little for their crops even as they were required to pay taxes in tobacco. Unlike wealthy planters who grew surpluses, modest growers struggled to meet these tax burdens. This economic strain set the stage for popular discontent. The distribution of land and wealth in Virginia compounded the colony's economic woes with social tension. The headright system and decades of large tobacco profits had allowed a class of elite planters to amass vast estates, especially in the fertile tidewater region along the coast. By contrast, the population of landless or land-poor colonists was growing. Every year, indentured servants completed their terms of service and became free. In theory, they expected to claim land of their own, but by the 1660s and 1670s, the best lands near navigable rivers were already monopolized by the planter gentry. With options limited, many freed servants and newer poor settlers pushed to the fringes of English settlement, the frontiers of the Piedmont and beyond, where they squatted on Indian land or took up small plots on the colony's borders. Life on this frontier was precarious. Settlers were more exposed to sporadic Native American raids, lived far from centers of power, and felt neglected by the colonial government. A contemporary observer summarized that Virginia's population by the mid-1670s was largely poor, indebted, discontented, and armed, an explosive combination. Governor Berkeley himself had earlier lamented the dangers of having a large class of landless freemen, writing how miserable that man is that governs a people, when 6 parts of 7 at least are poor, indebted, discontented, and armed. This majority of struggling colonists harbored grievances against the wealthy grandees who ran the government and seemed to prosper at their expense. Politically, Virginia in the late 17th century was an oligarchy in practice. Since the colony became a royal province in 1624, it had a 2-tier government, a royal governor appointed by the crown and a locally elected House of Burgesses. In Governor Sir William Berkeley, who held office for most of the period from 1642 to 1677, Virginia had an aristocratic leader deeply entwined with the planter elite. Under Berkeley's long tenure, political power was concentrated among a clique of loyal supporters, often referred to as the Green Spring faction after Berkeley's plantation. The governor controlled land grants, lucrative offices, and Indian trade licenses, and he dispensed these favors to his inner circle. Meanwhile, ordinary Virginians had limited recourse to change the status quo. Voting rights were tied to land ownership. In 1670, during Berkeley's rule, the franchise was officially restricted to property holders, disenfranchising landless freemen who had once been able to vote. Berkeley also declined to call new elections for years at a time when it suited him. In fact, the assembly sitting in 1676 had been unchanged for about 14 years until crisis forced Berkeley to summon a new one. Thus, on the eve of Bacon's rebellion, many frontier farmers and former servants felt politically voiceless. They saw the government as being run by and for the wealthy coastal planters. The charges later voiced in Bacon's 1676 manifesto reflected these popular views. Berkeley's regime was accused of advancing to places of judicature, scandalous and ignorant favorites, and of imposing great unjust taxes for private gain. Whether entirely fair or not, the perception was that the governor and his cronies enriched themselves, while common Virginians suffered. Virginia's troubles were further aggravated by tensions with England and international events. The restoration of King Charles II in 1660 brought tighter crown attention to colonial affairs. Berkeley, once a favorite of the king, initially benefited. He was reappointed governor in 1660 and even knighted. Yet Berkeley's views on colonial governance did not always align with imperial policy. He had long advocated for diversifying Virginia's economy away from over-reliance on tobacco and sought more local autonomy. In the early 1660s, he attempted to follow royal directives to encourage other industries and town building, but these efforts largely failed and only resulted in higher taxes that colonists resented. By the 1670s, Berkeley's influence at court waned. His patrons in London lost power, and the young king's circle had little patience for the aging governor. The Crown's interests, like enforcing the Navigation Acts and favoring certain courtier land grants, sometimes clashed with those of Virginia's locals. For example, Charles II had granted the northern neck of Virginia to two aristocrats, the Arlington and Culpeper Proprietary, threatening the land claims of many planters in that region. Berkeley had to spend resources to lobby and even attempt to buy out these proprietors to secure his colonists' land titles. Moreover, external threats such as Anglo-Dutch wars disrupted trade and spurred fears of attack. A Dutch fleet actually sailed up the James River and raided plantations in 1673 while the colony felt underdefended. To many Virginians, it seemed the mother country's policies and distant conflicts only brought economic pain and insecurity to the colony. This fostered a latent resentment toward royal authority that, while not the main spark of Bacon's rebellion, formed part of the wider context of dissatisfaction. In summary, by the mid-1670s, Virginia society rested on a shaky foundation. An economy, overly dependent on tobacco, was now faltering, squeezing small planters with low prices. Land hunger and the closing of the frontier, at least the legally sanctioned frontier, left a growing class of freemen frustrated and encroaching on indigenous lands. The colonial government, dominated by Berkeley and the planter aristocracy, appeared unresponsive to the needs of the many poor farmers in the backcountry. High taxes, trade restrictions, and perceived government corruption inflamed class antagonisms. As one historian put it, the uprising generally is depicted as a reaction to a perceived crisis in Virginia's economic, social, and political order. This crisis atmosphere only needed a trigger to erupt into violence, and that trigger would come on the colony's frontier, where the colonists' worsening circumstances met headlong with the desperate resistance of Native Americans defending their lands. The spark that ignited Bacon's rebellion was a series of escalating confrontations between frontier colonists, Native Americans, in 1675. Tensions between English settlers and the region's indigenous peoples had existed for decades, periodically flaring into open war, such as the Anglo-Powhatan Wars earlier in the century. By the 1670s, many native groups in eastern Virginia had been decimated or forced into tributary status under prior peace treaties. They lived in uneasy proximity to expanding English farms. On the frontier edges, however, more distant tribes like the Susquehannock and Doig still vied with colonists and with each other for land and resources. It was in this volatile borderland that a misunderstanding over a pig set off a chain reaction of bloodshed. In July 1675, a planter named Thomas Mathew in northern Virginia near the Potomac River had a dispute with a group of Doig Indians. Accounts differ as to the exact cause, but one contemporary narrative notes that the Dogigs came to Mathew's farm to collect a debt he owed them. When Mathew refused payment, they helped themselves to some of his pigs in lieu of compensation. Mathew and his neighbors responded with force, chasing the Doig party and killing several of them. This retaliation was precipitous and, as it turned out, poorly aimed. The local Susquehannock tribe, distinct from the Doigs, soon became entangled in the conflict. A Virginia militia pursuing the offending Indians mistakenly attacked a Susquehannock village, killing warriors who had not been involved in the initial incident. The situation deteriorated rapidly. The Susquehannocks, a powerful Algonquian-speaking people living along the upper Potomac, understandably saw the unprovoked assault as treachery, especially since the militia had reportedly killed some of their chiefs during a parley under a flag of truce. Enraged, Susquehannock war parties launched reprisal raids into Virginia and Maryland, striking isolated farms and homesteads along the frontier and killing dozens of colonists in the late summer and autumn of 1675. What became known as the Susquehannock War sent a wave of panic through the frontier settlements. Hundreds of frightened settlers fled from the outlying counties into more fortified towns closer to the coast, flooding into coastal communities and begging the government for help, as one account describes. The backcountry residents demanded decisive action to punish the enemy Indians and protect the frontier. Governor Berkeley, however, counseled caution. At 70 years old, Berkeley was a seasoned veteran of Indian diplomacy and conflict. He understood the complexity of the situation and the dangers of a general war. Recognizing that many native groups remained friendly or neutral towards the English, Berkeley refused to authorize indiscriminate retaliation. Instead, he pursued what he deemed a sounder strategy, defending the frontier with a string of small fortifications and keeping peace with those native tribes allied to the colony. In March 1676, the Colonial Assembly, with Berkeley's guidance, did declare war on hostile tribes responsible for the raids, but their plan emphasized building defensive forts and avoiding offensive expeditions that might entangle friendly Indians in the fray. Berkeley also issued strict instructions not to antagonize or attack peaceable tribes such as the Pamunkey, Mattaponi, and others who were tributaries of the English. From Berkeley's perspective, this approach was prudent and pragmatic. The governor feared that a full-scale Indian war could become uncontrollable, drawing in every tribe including those who had been loyal to the English. Indeed, the memory of the Anglo-Powhatan conflicts, when a broad native coalition had nearly wiped out the Jamestown colony in past massacres, loomed large. Berkeley's defensive policy aimed to contain the violence and prevent a pan-Indian uprising. However, to the embattled frontier colonists, this policy looked like cowardice, or worse, betrayal. Terrified for their lives and livelihoods, settlers denounced the plan to erect fortified garrisons as a boondoggle that would enrich the elite. They noted that the contracts for building the frontier forts were going to Berkeley's wealthy friends, who conveniently selected sites near their own plantations, ensuring those plantations would be well guarded at public expense. Poor farmers, meanwhile, would see more taxes to fund these forts and no guarantee of safety. Many frontiersmen believed a harsher stance was needed, drive out or destroy the marauding Indians outright, rather than sit behind fort walls. Berkeley's stance of privileging diplomacy with certain tribes also bred suspicions. Some colonists whispered that the governor's personal interests in the Indian deerskin and fur trade made him soft on the heathen. It was true that Berkeley and a few allies had profitable trading arrangements with friendly tribes exchanging English goods for pelts. Bacon and others later charged that protected and darling Indians were being spared because the governor and his circle enjoyed a large profit trade with them. Whether or not corruption was at play, many common Virginians felt their government was sacrificing their safety for selfish ends. By the spring of 1676, this volatile mix of fear, anger, and distrust exploded. In the words of historian Edmund Morgan, a small group of frontier colonists decided to take matters into their own hands. They found a leader in Nathaniel Bacon, a young, charismatic planter newly arrived in the colony but already well known on the upper James River for his energy and ambition. Bacon was actually a cousin by marriage to Governor Berkeley and a member of the elite by birth, but on the frontier he managed to cast himself as a champion of the common folk. When a militia of volunteer Indian fighters began gathering in Charles City County in April 1676, Bacon's neighbors urged him to take command of the ad hoc force. Initially hesitant, Bacon was swept up by the enthusiasm of the armed frontiersmen, who reputedly greeted his approach with shouts of "A Bacon! A Bacon! A Bacon!" Embracing the role, the 29-year-old Bacon assumed leadership of about 300 militiamen, who swore an oath to stick fast to him and their cause. They had resolved to wage war on the Indians in defiance of the governor's orders. Bacon later justified his actions in a letter, claiming he stepped up because the colony was basely betrayed by those in power, and that he had resolved to stand in this ruinous gap to defend the poor inhabitants sacrificed by Indian depredations. In May 1676, Bacon's militia struck out into the wilderness, determined to exact retribution. Governor Berkeley, outraged at this unauthorized campaign, swiftly declared Bacon and his followers rebels and mutineers for taking up arms without official sanction. Berkeley even chased after Bacon with a small loyalist force, but Bacon's men eluded the governor's grasp by marching deep into the forests where Berkeley's conservative militiamen dared not follow. The rebel volunteers first encountered the Occaneechi, a tribe based on an island in the Roanoke River who were trading partners with Virginia and had not been hostile. Bacon actually persuaded or coerced the Occaneechi to ally with him temporarily. He convinced them to attack a camp of Susquehannock refugees, which the Occaneechi did, returning with Susquehannock captives and scalps. Yet immediately after this apparent alliance, Bacon showed his ruthless intent. He turned on the Occaneechi themselves. In a surprise assault, Bacon's force massacred the Occaneechi village, killing men, women, and children and seizing their store of beaver pelts. This treacherous attack on a friendly tribe foreshadowed the indiscriminate nature of Bacon's campaign. As one modern historian noted, Bacon exhibited vengeful hatred of Indians, whatever their tribe and peaceableness, making no distinction between foes and allies. His followers' goal was not merely defensive action but the expulsion or destruction of all Indians nearby in order to claim their lands. Bacon's bold actions galvanized the frontier, but now he faced not only Indian enemies but also the colonial government's wrath. Upon learning of Bacon's unauthorized war, Governor Berkeley took the drastic step of dissolving the House of Burgesses in late May 1676 and calling for new elections, the first general election in Virginia in over a decade. Berkeley likely hoped a newly constituted assembly would support his position, or at least calm the situation. Ironically, this political gamble backfired. The election results demonstrated the depth of popular sympathy for Bacon's cause. Numerous pro-Bacon or reform-minded burgesses were elected from the frontier counties, and Bacon himself, despite being labeled a traitor, was elected to the House of Burgesses by the voters of Henrico County. Recognizing Bacon still enjoyed significant public backing, Berkeley shifted tactics. He offered Bacon a pardon if he would surrender and come to Jamestown peacefully. Bacon, emboldened by his recent foray, and perhaps sensing he could negotiate from strength, actually rode into Jamestown in June 1676 to take a seat in the assembly, and walked straight into Berkeley's trap. The governor had Bacon arrested on arrival for raising an illegal army. Under pressure and isolated from his armed supporters, Bacon consented to apologize on bended knee before Berkeley and the Burgesses, begging forgiveness for his misdeeds. Berkeley dramatically feigned mercy, pardoning Bacon and temporarily reinstating him to the council, hoping to neutralize the young firebrand. However, this reconciliation was fleeting. The assembly, with Bacon present, quickly set about passing a series of reforms addressing long-standing grievances, later known as Bacon's Laws. These measures in June 1676 curtailed some of the elite's abuses. They restored voting rights to landless freemen, limited holding multiple offices, and regulated unfair trade practices with the Indians. Notably, the new laws also banned the sale of arms to Native Americans and authorized defensive measures on the frontier. While these reforms met some of the protesters' demands, Bacon's own priority remained obtaining official sanction to wage war on all hostile Indians. When Governor Berkeley balked at granting him a military commission, the fragile peace shattered. On June 23, 1676, Bacon stormed out of Jamestown, then returned with several hundred armed men surrounding the State House. In one of the most dramatic showdowns in early American history, Bacon confronted Berkeley at gunpoint and demanded to be commissioned as general to lead the colony's forces against the Indians. Governor Berkeley, though elderly, refused to be cowed. He stepped forward before the muskets, flung open his coat, and baring his chest shouted, "Here! Shoot me before God, it is a fair mark! Shoot!" daring Bacon to kill him in front of everyone. The rebel leader hesitated, unwilling to murder the royal governor in cold blood, yet unable to back down without losing face. An observer noted that Berkeley's fearless defiance nearly provoked a disaster. With weapons drawn on both sides, the whole assembly was in peril of slaughter. To avoid bloodshed, the Burgesses urgently intervened and prevailed upon Berkeley to yield. Ultimately, the governor grudgingly granted Bacon the commission he sought, effectively legitimizing Bacon's authority for the moment and saving face for both men. As a contemporary put it, Virginia had its general and Bacon had his war. The personal backgrounds and motives of Nathaniel Bacon and Sir William Berkeley offer insight into the rebellion's trajectory. Although one was a rebel and the other the establishment, Bacon and Berkeley shared some common aristocratic roots, even as they diverged sharply in ideology and generation. Their clash in 1676 was in part a contest of personalities, the impetuous newcomer hungry for glory versus the proud old governor struggling to maintain order and authority. Nathaniel Bacon Jr. was not a rough-hewn frontiersman, but rather a member of England's gentry who arrived in Virginia with great expectations. Born on January 2, 1647, into a wealthy family in Suffolk, England, Bacon enjoyed an elite education. He studied at Cambridge University, where he earned a degree in 1667 and toured the European continent, the classic grand tour of a young gentleman. However, despite his advantages, Bacon developed a reputation for trouble. He married without his wealthy father-in-law's permission, leading to a familial rift. More scandalously, Bacon became entangled in a fraudulent scheme to swindle a neighbor out of an inheritance, resulting in a lawsuit that tarnished his name. Likely to remove him from further disgrace, Bacon's father provided him a substantial stake, £1,800, a fortune at the time, and packed him off to Virginia in 1674 to start anew. At age 27, Bacon thus arrived in the colony as a well-funded immigrant with impeccable connections. In fact, he was kin to some of Virginia's most powerful families. His cousin by marriage was none other than Lady Frances Berkeley, the governor's wife. Governor Berkeley welcomed young Bacon into the fold, granting him a prime land grant of 820 acres at Curl's Neck on the James River and a seat on the governor's council in March 1675. By these marks, Bacon swiftly joined the upper echelon of Virginian society. Yet Nathaniel Bacon did not remain a loyal courtier for long. Contemporary descriptions portray him as intelligent, eloquent, and ambitious, but also arrogant and impulsive. One hostile chronicler called him young, bold, active, of an inviting aspect, but of a most pernicious and wicked mind. Bacon's ability to captivate the masses was undeniable. He was a compelling orator who spoke passionately about the colony's ills. Despite his aristocratic pedigree, Bacon managed to channel the grievances of the common planters. Several factors likely shaped his turn against Berkeley's regime. For one, Bacon had a genuine enmity toward local Indians, perhaps inflamed by personal loss. During the escalating raids of 1675, Bacon's own overseer at his plantation, Bacon's quarter, was killed by attacking Indians. This murder would have given Bacon an immediate, visceral stake in frontier defense. Moreover, Bacon had entrepreneurial designs that clashed with Berkeley's interests. He dabbled in the fur trade with frontier tribes, partnering with fellow planter William Byrd in Western commerce. Berkeley's tight regulation of the Indian trade, favoring a few insiders, would have irked Bacon as an impediment to profit and as evidence of the governor's favoritism. Later reports indeed accused Bacon of using the issue of Indian hostilities as a pretext to muscle into the lucrative deerskin trade that Berkeley's friends dominated. Whether or not profit was a primary motive, Bacon clearly resented Berkeley's monopoly on power and resources. By positioning himself as the leader of an armed popular movement, Bacon found an opportunity to supplant the established order and perhaps envision himself as the colony's savior, or its next ruler. In contrast to Bacon's meteoric rise and brief prominence, Sir William Berkeley had a long and storied career at the colony's helm. Born in 1605 into an English noble family, Berkeley was educated at Oxford and ingratiated himself with the court of King Charles I. He earned a reputation as a playwright and a courtier before being appointed governor of Virginia in 1642. Berkeley's first administration, 1642 to 1652, was marked by strength and vision. He presided over the colony during the English Civil War period, even organizing Virginia's militia to repel a Dutch naval attack in 1652. A devout royalist, Berkeley briefly lost power when parliamentarians took control. Virginia was actually the last colony to submit to Cromwell in 1652, but he triumphantly returned to govern again after the Restoration in 1660. Thus, by 1676, Sir William had governed Virginia for roughly 27 years in total, a record tenure that made him synonymous with the colonial establishment. Berkeley was knighted and held proprietary interests. He was even named one of the Lords Proprietors of the Carolinas, reinforcing his status among America's elite. Under Berkeley's leadership, Virginia had enjoyed periods of stability and growth. He encouraged diversification of crops, promoting silk, wine, and other industries to lessen dependence on tobacco, maintained peace with local tribes for decades after 1646, and welcomed the influx of Royalist cavaliers who fled to Virginia after Charles I's execution, which helped entrench a high-born plantation class in the colony. However, Berkeley's approach to governance was paternalistic and authoritarian. He once famously thanked God that there were no free schools nor printing in Virginia, and hoped none would be established for 100 years, for learning bred disobedience and heresy in his view. This quip, whether earnest or not, illustrated Berkeley's preference for order and tradition over liberty and dissent. As he aged, Berkeley grew even less tolerant of opposition. By the 1670s, observers noted that the governor had become peevish and prone to temper. The burdens of governing, declining health, an ailing economy, and factional conflicts made him rely heavily on a shrinking clique of advisors and on the counsel of his young second wife, Frances Culpeper Berkeley. His favoritism toward loyal friends and relatives by marriage was widely resented. Those outside his charmed circle saw him as nepotistic and altered by marrying a young wife, from his wanted public good to a covetous folly age, as a contemporary criticism put it. Berkeley was accused of turning a blind eye to officials' corruption and of enriching himself through his offices. Some evidence supports these charges. After the rebellion, royal commissioners found that Berkeley had seized rebel property without due process and was using it to enrich himself, reinforcing the image of him as self-serving. Berkeley's stance during the crisis of 1675 to 1676 was guided by two consistent principles of his rule: protect the colony's stability, which meant avoiding all-out Indian war, and uphold the prerogatives of the government, which meant crushing insubordination. To Berkeley, Bacon's insurgency threatened everything he had worked for. It undermined lawful authority and risked a ruinous conflict. It is telling that even after Bacon had burned Jamestown and Berkeley had been forced to flee, the old Cavalier never wavered in his loyalty to the crown or his sense of duty to assert control. He reportedly declared he would have hanged half the country to put down the rebellion if not restrained. King Charles II himself later remarked with disapproval that Berkeley had hanged more men in that naked country than I did for the murder of my father, indicating the governor's harsh retribution went beyond royal wishes. Berkeley's intransigence and severity in suppressing the rebellion would contribute to his downfall, as the king's commissioners in early 1677 judged him too brutal and removed him from the governorship. He died in disgrace shortly after returning to England, without ever having the chance to clear his name with Charles II. In sum, Bacon and Berkeley personified a generational and ideological divide in 1670s Virginia. Bacon, the restless second-generation colonist indeed, a newcomer with outsider cachet, gave voice to colonists' grievances and was willing to defy royal authority in pursuit of what he viewed as the public's interest and his own aggrandizement. Berkeley, the entrenched patriarch of the colony, valued hierarchy, loyalty to the crown, and measured approaches to problems, values that many struggling Virginians felt no longer served them. Their conflict was not simply personal. It symbolized the pent-up frustration of a community where a burgeoning disaffected underclass found leadership in a discontented aristocrat, turning him against his own class. As the rebellion unfolded, their decisions, Bacon's fiery populist appeal and brutal Indian policies, Berkeley's obstinate defense of his authority at any cost, shaped the rebellion's course and legacy. With Bacon now effectively granted a general's commission in June 1676, Virginia plunged into civil war. For several months, rival forces of Bacon's rebels and Berkeley's loyalists, derided by the rebels as the court party, vied for control of the colony. Bacon wasted no time in resuming his campaign against the Indians, while Berkeley, once freed from Bacon's brief captivity, renounced the compromise and again declared Bacon a traitor. Each man mobilized supporters for the struggle that lay ahead. The colony's population was thus starkly divided. Bacon commanded the support of a large contingent of frontier planters, small farmers, indentured servants, and even some African and English bond laborers, whereas Berkeley leaned on a core of long-established planters, crown officials, and mercantile interests, primarily in the Tidewater region. As Bacon's men later proclaimed, they fought not against England, but against the powerful cabal around Berkeley that they accused of privileging Indians and lining their pockets with taxes. Throughout the summer of 1676, the rebellion spread across Virginia, characterized by confused allegiances and outbreaks of violence. Bacon established his base at Middle Plantation, the site of present-day Williamsburg, strategically located between the York and James Rivers. From there, he issued formal declarations on July 30th, 1676, laying out the rebellion's justifications. Bacon's Declaration of the People charged Berkeley's government with corruption, unjust taxation, and failure to protect the colony from the murders and depredations of the Indians. He specifically accused Berkeley of having protected, favored, and emboldened the Indians against His Majesty's loyal subjects. This propaganda helped Bacon frame his revolt as a defense of the crown's true interests against a rogue governor, an important rhetorical strategy since Bacon did not openly renounce King Charles II and in fact claimed loyalty to the monarch. He signed himself general, by consent of the people, asserting a populist legitimacy for his command. Meanwhile, Governor Berkeley had regrouped on Virginia's eastern shore, where he rallied any loyal militiamen and even mustered friendly native allies. Notably, Berkeley turned to Queen Kakakoski of the Pamunkey for assistance. The Pamunkey were one of the tributary tribes still allied to the English under the 1646 treaty. Kakakoski was a successor of the Powhatan line. Her late husband Totopotomoy had died fighting for the English in 1656. Berkeley asked Kakakoski to provide warriors to help subdue Bacon's rebel forces and fight hostile tribes. In a remarkable episode, Kakakoski appeared before the Governor's Council in Jamestown in June 1676, wearing a regal wampum-adorned mantle and accompanied by her son as interpreter. Initially silent under the councilor's demands, she erupted in an impassioned speech when pressed too far. She reminded the English of Pamunkey loyalty and sacrifice, crying out Totopotomoy Chepiak, Totopotomoy is dead, invoking her husband's death in English service as an indictment of colonial ingratitude. Her speech, reportedly 15 minutes of fervent reproach, highlighted that many Pamunkey warriors had died for the English at the Battle of Bloody Run against invading Westo Indians, and that the colonists had failed to compensate or protect her people. The council was largely unmoved. Ultimately, Kakakoski grudgingly agreed to send a token force of 12 bowmen, far fewer than the English expected from her nation. This tense interaction illustrated that Virginia's tributary tribes were themselves caught in a dangerous bind, mistrusted by the English yet also targets of Bacon's indiscriminate fury. As Berkeley scraped together forces, Bacon took the initiative on the battlefield. In late summer 1676, he marched on what he perceived as the remaining threat. Not Berkeley at first, but the friendly tribes in Tidewater, Virginia, whom he suspected of harboring or aiding the enemy, or simply occupying land he coveted. In August, Bacon led about 300 militiamen in a foray up the Pamunkey River to locate Kakakoski's people. The Pamunkey, having refused to join Bacon, became one of his targets. Warned of Bacon's approach, Kakakoski and roughly 700 Pamunkey fled into the Great Dragon Swamp Dragon Run, a dense, marshy wilderness where outsiders could easily get lost. Bacon's men struggled to find them in the tangled bayous. They managed to capture an elderly Pamunkey woman, reportedly Kakakoski's childhood nurse, and demanded she lead them to the hiding queen. The nurse deliberately led the rebels on a wild chase through the swamps for days until the frustrated Baconites realized her ruse and killed the captive woman. Kakakoski herself narrowly escaped. She later recounted that during her 14 days in hiding, she survived only by eating a raw turtle leg a boy had caught for her. Bacon's raiders ransacked the Pamunkey camp, seizing furs, burning supplies, and capturing 45 members of the tribe to sell as slaves. At least 8 Pamunkey were killed in the incursion. The once loyal Pamunkey thus suffered grievously at the hands of the colonists they thought of as allies. Bacon's unprovoked onslaught against them vindicated Kakakoski's reluctance to send her warriors to aid the English. She had wisely counseled her people not to join either side of the English civil conflict. For the Pamunkey and other tribes, Bacon's rebellion was not viewed through the lens of good guys and bad guys in the English power struggle. It was an indiscriminate assault on all natives, friend or foe. Bacon sought to drive the natives from the land entirely, and in doing so he treated even tributary peoples as enemies, leaving lasting bitterness. After ranging against the Indians, Bacon turned his full attention back to the colonial capital. In September 1676, news reached him that Governor Berkeley had returned from the eastern shore with a small force and reoccupied Jamestown. The governor was attempting to reestablish his authority in the colony's core while Bacon was off in the hinterlands. In response, Bacon marched his army, by now numbering several hundred men, swiftly to Jamestown. Berkeley, finding himself outnumbered, withdrew across the Chesapeake Bay once more, ceding the capital. Determined that Jamestown not become a foothold for Berkeley again, Bacon made a fateful decision. On September 19, 1676, he ordered Jamestown to be burned to the ground. Bacon's forces put the torch to Virginia's capital city, destroying the State House, the church, and many homes. Contemporary reports describe an immense conflagration lighting up the night as the rebels reduced the colony's only town of note to ash. The dramatic image of Jamestown in flames, immortalized in later artwork by Howard Pyle, testified to the rebellion's ferocity. Bacon reportedly preferred to leave a nest of rogues, as he called the capital's officials, without any base of operations. The burning of Jamestown was the climax of Bacon's rebellion, a symbolic and literal attack on the seat of colonial authority. For a brief moment after Jamestown's fall, Bacon was effectively in control of much of Virginia. His improvised regime at Middle Plantation drew up oaths of loyalty which many settlers felt compelled to sign, swearing support for Bacon's cause on pain of confiscation or exile. 70 leading men endorsed his leadership in early August, and a second radical declaration even called for the formation of a new assembly under Bacon's authority. The rebellion showed signs of evolving from an ad hoc uprising into a revolutionary government. One rebel sympathizer, Sarah Drummond, wife of a rebel commander, went so far as to urge Bacon to declare outright independence from England, reputedly saying, "I fear the power of England no more than a broken straw," and proposing a Virginian republic. Such extreme views were not common, but they indicate how far the ferment had gone in some circles. However, Bacon's ascendancy was remarkably short-lived. Even as he scorched Jamestown, his coalition was starting to fray. Disease and desertion did what Berkeley's resistance could not. In late October 1676, only about a month after his greatest triumph, Nathaniel Bacon died suddenly of dysentery, the bloody flux. The rebel leader's demise was almost anticlimactic. Afflicted by fever and diarrhea, Bacon reportedly succumbed after several agonizing days and was buried in secret. Legend says his body was interred in an unmarked grave to prevent mutilation by his enemies, deprived of their charismatic admiral. The rebel forces rapidly disintegrated. Bacon's lieutenants, lacking his personal authority and fearful of the approaching royal forces, either surrendered or fled. One by one, pockets of rebellion were extinguished. In January 1677, the last significant rebel holdouts capitulated to Berkeley's troops. Governor Berkeley returned to find a devastated capital and a chastened colony. He wasted no time in exacting vengeance. Berkeley convened courts-martial that meted out summary justice to the rebellion's ringleaders. Some 23 rebel men were hanged for treason on Berkeley's orders, including notable figures such as William Drummond, Sarah's husband. The governor's harsh reprisals alarmed even his fellow elites, not out of sympathy for the rebels, but because it seemed to exhibit an intemperate zeal for blood. When word of the rebellion and Berkeley's response reached London, King Charles II dispatched a commission of inquiry, along with 1,000 red-coated royal troops to restore order and investigate the causes of this late horrid rebellion. The royal commissioners, arriving in early 1677, were dismayed by Berkeley's cruelties and seized properties. They rebuked the governor for too far exceeding his mandate in punishing rebels. In the end, Berkeley was relieved of his governorship. In April 1677, Sir Herbert Jeffreys, one of the commissioners, assumed control as the new royal governor, and Berkeley was compelled to sail to England to defend his conduct. The aged Berkeley died en route in July 1677, leaving his name indelibly linked to the rebellion that had nearly toppled him. Bacon's rebellion, though ultimately quelled, left a deep imprint on Virginia. For the colonists, the months of chaos were remembered as our time of anarchy. Plantations had been looted by both rebel and loyalist forces, opportunistically settling old grudges. Far-flung farms lay abandoned or destroyed in the wake of Indian raids or militia reprisals. The colony's only town was in ruins. It took several years for the economy and society to stabilize under firm royal control. The Crown took the opportunity to strengthen its direct oversight, reducing the autonomy of local grandees. An English garrison remained for some time to prevent further insurrection and deter Indian incursions. But even after troops left, the underlying tensions persisted. Many of the issues that had fueled the uprising, land shortage, wealth inequality, taxation, and security, still simmered. The difference was that Virginia's ruling class, shocked by how close they came to losing everything, moved decisively to restructure colonial society in a way that would avert future alliances between disenfranchised whites and black slaves against the elite. One of the most significant outcomes of Bacon's rebellion was its impact on Virginia's labor system and the codification of racial slavery. The rebellion had been, in part, a revolt of the underclass. The fact that black slaves and white servants had fought side by side in Bacon's ranks deeply alarmed the planter elite. To the gentry, this demonstrated the potential for a multiracial coalition of the poor to threaten their power. In the rebellion's wake, Virginia's legislature and landowners took deliberate steps to harden the lines of race and status, ensuring that such an alliance would never recur. In the decades before Bacon's rebellion, Virginia's workforce was largely composed of European indentured servants. Tens of thousands of English and some Irish and Scotch indentured servants had been brought to the Chesapeake since 1607, typically bound to 4 to 7 years of labor, after which they would be freed. In the colony's early years, enslaved Africans were comparatively few and sometimes held ambiguous status. As late as 1670, the number of African slaves in Virginia was relatively small, a few thousand at most, perhaps less than 5% of the population, while indentured Europeans made up the bulk of field laborers. However, this balance was already beginning to shift by the 1670s. Economic and demographic changes were reducing the supply of willing indentured servants from England. After the Restoration, with political stability at home, fewer desperate migrants felt compelled to seek opportunity overseas. Improving conditions in England and the rise of alternative colonies like Pennsylvania after 1681 made Virginia less of a magnet for the English poor. Additionally, word had spread of the harsh conditions that awaited servants in the tobacco fields, and the prospect of finishing one's indenture penniless on the frontier was not enticing. One analysis notes that by the 1670s, the Virginia gentry had already started to replace white indentured servants with enslaved Africans on their plantations. This transition was still in progress when Bacon's rebellion erupted. Indeed, both indentured servants and enslaved people took part in the rebellion, lured by Bacon's promise of freedom for those who joined his army. We have records that some enslaved Africans and free blacks rallied to Bacon, a terrifying development for the elite who had not previously seen a common cause between poor whites and blacks. After the rebellion, the planter class moved quickly to ensure racial unity between poor and wealthy whites and a stricter separation of blacks from whites. The House of Burgesses began passing laws that gave small concessions to white freemen while imposing new restrictions on Africans. For instance, tax reforms lowered the poll tax burden on impoverished white farmers, shifting taxation more onto property, which the gentry dominated to appease the poor whites. More dramatically, throughout the 1680s and 1690s, Virginia enacted a series of slave codes that cemented the status of Africans as hereditary, lifetime slaves and curtailed their rights severely. In 1680, a law prohibited any enslaved person from carrying weapons or leaving their plantation without permission, and allowed harsh punishment for any perceived insubordination. A 1682 law clarified that all imported non-Christian servants, that is Africans and many Indians, were slaves for life. In 1691, Virginia outlawed interracial marriage and sexual relations, threatening banishment for any white person who had a child with an African or Native person, reflecting an official effort to prevent the formation of mixed-race communities and sympathies. Finally, the Comprehensive Virginia Slave Code of 1705 legally institutionalized the racial caste system. It codified that all blacks and their children were real estate chattel, and that even free blacks would be stripped of many legal rights. The 1705 Code and its precursors were explicitly intended, as one clause put it, for the better government of Negroes and slaves, and to divide black slaves from white servants in status. No longer would a poor white indentured man see himself in the same boat as an enslaved African. One could anticipate freedom and land, however modest, while the other was deemed property for life. Historians like Edmund S. Morgan argue that these measures were a direct response to the events of 1676. The ruling class, having witnessed the alliance between European indentured servants and Africans in Bacon's rebellion, deliberately set out to create a social wedge of racism to prevent future united uprisings. In Morgan's analysis, American slavery, meaning a fully racialized slave system, and American freedom, the relative egalitarianism among whites, grew together out of this strategy. The Virginia elite extended more privileges to poor whites. For example, by the early 18th century, voting rights, while still tied to property, became more attainable as land opened up. Militia service and other participatory roles were framed as rights of free Englishmen. Simultaneously, they fostered a sense of superiority among even the lowest status whites by emphasizing that they were free people and not subject to the degradation of slavery, which was now reserved for people of African descent. As one stark illustration, by 1705 a Christian white servant's term was limited and regulated, whereas an African's condition was lifelong bondage inherited by their children. Laws forbade interracial cooperation. Even the act of a white person helping a fugitive slave was heavily penalized. In essence, the color line hardened after Bacon's rebellion. The economic calculus also favored a turn toward slavery. In the decades around 1700, the transatlantic slave trade boomed, making enslaved Africans more available and, relative to lifetime labor, more cost-effective than indentured Europeans. The Royal African Company, chartered in 1672, began importing large numbers of captive Africans to the Chesapeake. By about 1700, Virginia's slave population was expanding exponentially, while the flow of indentured servants waned. Planters saw many advantages in slave labor. Slaves could not demand land or freedom dues after a term. They could be controlled by violence without legal repercussions, and, via the principle of partus sequitur ventrem established in 1662, children born to enslaved mothers were automatically slaves, providing a self-reproducing workforce. This 1662 law, decreeing that the child shall be held bond or free according to the condition of the mother, was one of the first explicit codifications of slavery based on heredity in English North America. It meant that an enslaved woman's offspring would never threaten to swell the ranks of landless freemen. They would remain enslaved and thus no political or economic competition to the planters. Over time, such statutes created a stark racial caste system. Skin color became the defining line of servitude, and a host of legal disabilities marked out people of African origin. They could not bear arms, testify against whites in court, or gather in groups, among other restrictions. By the early 18th century, Virginia had been transformed. It was now a society with a large enslaved African labor force and a more entrenched planter aristocracy. Bacon's rebellion failed in the short term to topple the ruling elite, but ironically it helped consolidate the elite's power in the long run. The aftermath saw the planter elite consolidated power and actually intensified social inequalities. The difference was those inequalities were increasingly seen through a racial lens rather than a purely class lens. Poor whites gained some opportunities, or at least no longer felt completely powerless, because they could aspire to occupy the social rung above enslaved blacks. As a result, never again in colonial Virginia did a rebellion unite black and white underclass figures in common cause. The next major uprisings in the South, like the Stono Rebellion of 1739 in South Carolina, were exclusively slave revolts, without white participation, and they were met with unified repression from the white population, including poor whites. In short, the legacy of Bacon's rebellion was to accelerate Virginia's transition to a slave society and to embed racial divisions more deeply into its laws and culture. As one scholar succinctly noted, after 1676, the number of white indentured servants began to drop, and the number of enslaved Africans rose, not long after the rebellion. The population statistics bear this out. In 1670, enslaved Africans were a small minority in Virginia. By 1700, they constituted perhaps 20% of the population, and by 1750, nearly 40%. Correspondingly, new white immigration, especially of indentured laborers, slowed to a trickle. Those white colonists who did come were more likely to be property-holding migrants or skilled artisans, not penniless laborers, because planters now preferred to invest in slaves. The ruling class had learned that a large disenfranchised white underclass was a threat to stability. Far better, from their perspective, to have a permanently enslaved class of Africans and to enfold the poorer whites into the polity as lesser participants in white supremacy. Thus, Bacon's rebellion stands as a turning point. Before the rebellion, class tensions between rich and poor English settlers dominated politics. After the rebellion, race increasingly defined power dynamics with a greater sense of shared whiteness, uniting the European-descended colonists across class lines as against peoples of color kept in bondage. This was not an overnight change. Laws and attitudes shifted over a generation or two, but Bacon's rebellion was the catalyst that convinced leaders like William Byrd, who survived the rebellion, and others that dividing by race was safer than being divided by class. As historian Edmund Morgan observed, Virginia's oligarchs, worried by Bacon's multi-class revolt, deliberately nurtured racism as a tool of governance. The tragedy, of course, was that this condemned Africans and their descendants to centuries of cruel enslavement, even as it diffused the class antagonism among whites. While Bacon's rebellion was unique to Virginia's conditions, it was not an isolated incident in colonial America. The late 17th and early 18th centuries saw multiple uprisings, wars, and revolts across the colonies, each born from local grievances, but reflecting common themes of resistance to authority and violent contestation for power. Comparing Bacon's rebellion to other conflicts of the era, such as King Philip's War 1675 to 1676, in New England, Leisler's Rebellion 1689 to 1691 in New York, and the Stono Rebellion 1739 in South Carolina, reveals a landscape of near-constant turmoil as colonists, Native Americans, and enslaved people all challenged the status quo in different ways. King Philip's War, which erupted in New England in 1675, almost exactly contemporary with Bacon's rebellion, was one of the deadliest conflicts in colonial American history. Whereas Bacon's conflict was partly colonists versus colonial government, King Philip's War was fundamentally colonists versus Native Americans. The Wampanoag Sachem Metacom, known to the English as King Philip, forged a multi-tribal alliance to resist further English encroachment on indigenous lands in New England. The war was sparked by mounting grievances over land seizures, livestock destroying native crops, and the execution of 3 Wampanoags by Plymouth Colony. The conflict rapidly spread across Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, with the Wampanoag, Narragansett, Nipmuc, and other Algonquian peoples launching coordinated attacks on colonial towns. In terms of intensity, King Philip's War was the bloodiest war per capita of population in colonial American history, with perhaps 5% of New England's English inhabitants killed and a far higher percentage of native people decimated. Entire settlements were burned and abandoned. By the time it ended in late 1676, almost the same moment Bacon's rebellion fizzled out, King Philip's War had shattered Native American power in southern New England, virtually eliminating organized indigenous resistance there. Metacom was killed and hundreds of native captives were executed or sold into slavery in the West Indies. Though geographically separate, King Philip's War and Bacon's rebellion shared underlying drivers, expansionist pressures, and mutual fear between colonists and Native Americans. Both conflicts were fueled by colonists' hunger for land and the perception that only force could secure their frontiers, in New England's case, preemptive, force against a wide native coalition, in Virginia's case, reactive force against scattered raids. Interestingly, news of King Philip's War in 1675 had reached Virginia and reportedly heightened Virginians' fears of their own native neighbors. Bacon's followers knew that across the colonies, colonists and Indians were locked in mortal combat. This likely added urgency to their demands for action against Virginia's tribes. In the grand tableau, 1675 to 1676 was a continent-wide convulsion. New England was aflame with Indian war, even as Virginia descended into rebellion. A historian aptly noted, the late 17th century was a time of great violence and turmoil. Bacon's rebellion turned white Virginians against one another. King Philip's War shattered Native American resistance in New England. These simultaneous upheavals underscored that English colonial expansion was meeting fierce opposition, both from within the discontent of colonists like Bacon, and from without the resistance of native confederacies like Metacom's. In New York, a different kind of rebellion unfolded a decade later. Leisler's Rebellion, 1689 to 1691, occurred in the aftermath of England's glorious revolution of 1688. When James II was overthrown and William and Mary assumed the throne, colonists in New York seized the opportunity to revolt against the dominion of New England's regime. A German-born merchant and militia captain, Jacob Leisler, led the rebellion. Leisler rallied the support of small farmers, city artisans, and the non-elite population of New York City against a small aristocratic, ruling elite that had dominated the colony under James's governor. In June 1689, Leisler's militia took control of Fort James, renaming it Fort William, and effectively took over the government. proclaiming loyalty to the new Protestant monarchs William and Mary. Leisler installed himself as acting lieutenant governor in an effort to secure the colony against rumored threats, including a feared French and Papist plot. For roughly 18 months, Leisler's government, a revolutionary committee, held power in New York, marking one of the first instances of colonists self-governing in defiance of royal authority. However, Leisler's regime was fragile and controversial. In 1691, when a royal governor, Henry Sloughter, finally arrived with troops, Leisler hesitated to yield command. This led to a brief armed clash between Leisler's supporters and the new governor's forces. Leisler was captured, tried for treason, and executed by hanging in May 1691, along with his son-in-law. Leisler's rebellion reflected many of the same themes as Bacon's: resentment of a small aristocratic elite and anger at an out-of-touch government imposed from above. Whereas Bacon's rebels targeted Berkeley's clique and sought local frontier security, Leisler's rebels targeted the remnants of James II's regime and demanded broader representation and defense against external threats, namely the French and their native allies in Canada. Both uprisings demonstrate how colonial populations could fracture along class and ethnic lines. Leisler, for instance, drew support from Dutch and other non-English settlers who felt marginalized, whereas Bacon drew from inland English planters and servants. Both also ended with the old order reasserting control and executing the rebel leaders, but not without leaving political ripples. In New York, Leisler's faction, largely middle-class Dutch merchants and artisans, remained a force in politics, and the society remained divided between pro- and anti-Leisler factions for years. The same period saw other insurgencies. In 1689, Maryland's Protestants, led by John Coode, revolted against the Catholic proprietary government of Lord Baltimore, often called Coode's Rebellion. Much like Leisler's movement, Coode's forces took power under the banner of the new Protestant monarchs and overthrew a local elite seen as illegitimate. These various rebellions in 1689 were sparked by the power vacuum and ideological shifts of the Glorious Revolution, whereas Bacon's rebellion predates that and was more of an internal colonial conflict. Yet all speak to a recurrent pattern. When authority was weak or perceived as unjust, colonists banded together, often across class lines initially, to demand change, though their unity was frequently short-lived. Shifting focus to the 18th century, the specter of slave rebellion became a constant anxiety in the South, especially as African populations grew. The most infamous colonial slave uprising was the Stono Rebellion of 1739 in South Carolina. Early on the morning of September 9, 1739, a group of about 20 enslaved Africans, led by men believed to be from the Kingdom of Congo, raided a store near the Stono River, about 20 miles from Charleston. They armed themselves with guns and began marching south toward Spanish Florida, shouting liberty, likely aware that Spain had promised freedom to any slave who reached Florida and converted to Catholicism. Along the way, the rebels gathered more recruits. Their numbers swelled to perhaps 60 to 80, and they attacked several plantations, killing roughly 20 to 25 white colonists in the process. The rebellion was short-lived. By that afternoon, South Carolina's militia confronted the band of slaves. In the ensuing confrontation, the militia killed many of the rebels and dispersed the rest. Most of the runaways were hunted down in subsequent weeks and either killed or captured. In total, about 35 to 50 slaves died in the uprising or its aftermath. The Stono Rebellion shocked the Southern colonists. It was the largest slave revolt in British North America prior to the Revolutionary era, and it revealed the potential for enslaved Africans to organize violently for freedom. The immediate result was a severe tightening of the slave code in South Carolina. The Negro Act of 1740 was passed, which further restricted slaves' movements, assembly, and education. It became illegal to teach enslaved people to read, for instance. Plantation patrols and militia vigilance were increased to prevent future revolts. The broader context of the Stono Rebellion connects back to Bacon's rebellion in a thematic way: fear of the oppressed group uniting and rising up. Where Bacon's rebellion had demonstrated the danger of a mixed underclass revolt, Stono demonstrated the danger of a primarily black revolt in a slave society. Both led to harsher legal regimes to prevent recurrence: the 1740 South Carolina Code after Stono, like the 1705 Virginia Code after Bacon's era. There is also an international dimension. Stono occurred during the War of Jenkins' Ear between Britain and Spain's policy of offering asylum to British slaves to destabilize British colonies helped trigger the rebellion. Similarly, Bacon's rebellion occurred in the milieu of imperial wars, Anglo-Dutch wars and competition, though its triggers were more local. Taken together, Bacon's rebellion, King Philip's War, Leisler's rebellion, and the Stono Rebellion show that colonial America was far from monolithic or peaceful. Different regions experienced different flashpoints: frontier settlers and government clash in Virginia, colonists and Indians in New England, urban factionalism in New York, enslaved resistance in the South. But all these conflicts point to a new world in flux where authority was contested and often violently reshaped. Historian Michael Wilcox has termed the period a time of colonial feedback loops, where violence in one area begot changes and reprisals in another. By 1700, the English colonies had largely crushed overt military challenges, Native American power was broken in many areas, and internal rebellions had been subdued. But the legacy of these 17th century upheavals profoundly influenced colonial policies. There was a conscious effort to balance the interests of different groups to avoid future strife, whether that meant pacifying poor whites with Indian land and privileges, firmly delineating racial slavery, or granting colonies more autonomy in local matters after 1689 to keep populous content. In a way, these conflicts also served as learning experiences for colonists. They learned their capacity to self-organize, whether for good or ill, and elites learned strategies to divide or appease potential opposition. The memory of these events lingered. For instance, a century later, during the American Revolution, Virginia's leaders were aware of the power of common men in arms and were careful to enlist their support against Britain, channeling discontent outward rather than inward. Often overshadowed in narratives of Bacon's rebellion are the voices and experiences of the Native American peoples who were central to the conflict's origin and bore some of its worst consequences. For the Dog, Susquehannock, Pamunkey, Occaneechi, and other tribes of the region, the mid-1670s were a time of peril and profound loss. Bacon's rebellion, from their vantage point, appeared as an unpredictable wave of English aggression, one that did not distinguish between friend and foe. The rebellion both reflected and intensified the pressures Native communities faced as English colonial expansion reached a tipping point. The initial incident at Thomas Mathew's plantation, involving the Doig tribe, illustrates how Native Americans were caught in impossible situations with colonists. The Doigs had been trading and interacting with Virginia settlers, but as English debts to them went unpaid and colonial livestock strayed onto native lands, disputes were inevitable. When Mathew and his neighbors killed some Doigs over the alleged pig theft, the Doig understandably retaliated to defend their honor and property. That this ordinary dispute escalated to all-out war was partly due to mistaken identity and extreme retribution. The colonial militia's misdirected attack on the Susquehannock under a flag of truce was essentially an act of treachery. Susquehannock accounts, though filtered through later retellings, would no doubt emphasize this betrayal. 5 Susquehannock chiefs had come out to parley and were brutally slain by the Virginia and Maryland forces who had besieged their fort. The Susquehannock response was one of rage and desperation. Having lost their leaders and many people, they fought back ferociously, raiding English homesteads in a bid to exact revenge and secure resources to survive the oncoming winter. We can imagine the Susquehannocks' perspective. They had been driven from their ancestral Susquehanna Valley by Iroquois pressure not long before, seeking refuge near the Potomac under tenuous friendship with Maryland. Now, suddenly, they were attacked by those they hadn't even wronged, slaughtered after attempting diplomacy. Their war against the Virginia and Maryland colonists in 1675 to 1676 was a fight for survival. Though they managed to inflict considerable fear and damage, the Susquehannock ultimately could not withstand the united colonial forces. By 1677, surviving Susquehannocks either merged with larger tribes, some reportedly joined the Iroquois or moved west, or were reduced to a scattered remnant. The Susquehannock polity effectively ceased to exist as an independent entity as a result of these events. Many were sold into slavery. New England tried to send captured Algonquians to the Caribbean after King Philip's War, and the Chesapeake colonists likewise sometimes sold war captives south. The Pamunkey tribe, led by Queen Kakakoski, experienced Bacon's rebellion as a shocking betrayal by people they considered allies. The Pamunkey were one of the member tribes of the old Powhatan chiefdom and had been under English protection since the Treaty of 1646. For 30 years, Kakakoski maintained loyalty to the English. Her husband Totopotamoa had died fighting alongside colonial forces against enemy tribes. During Bacon's rebellion, however, all those years of alliance proved fragile. The rebels who swarmed into Pamunkey territory in 1676 did not care that the Pamunkey had remained peaceful and had even just refused Berkeley's request to fight Bacon's men. In the eyes of Bacon's militia, an Indian was an Indian, a hindrance to be removed, regardless of prior friendship. Kakakoski's famous outcry, "Totopotamoy is dead," was a plaintive reminder that her people had bled for the colonists in the past, the silence with which Berkeley's council greeted her protest. They offered not a word of comfort or acknowledgement of Pamunkey losses, speaks volumes about colonial attitudes. Even loyal Indians' grievances were dismissed. When Bacon's rebels later invaded her village, Kakakoski had to flee for her life, an experience of personal trauma that would become legend in her community, hiding and nearly starving in the swamps. After the rebellion, Kakakoski's situation was bittersweet. On one hand, she emerged as a key native negotiator in the peace settlement at the Treaty of Middle Plantation 1677. Kakakoski took a leading role. The English Crown's commissioners recognized her as Queen of Pamunkey, and a faithful friend to the English recommending she be compensated for her losses. In Articles 12 and 18 of that treaty, the English actually reaffirmed and somewhat expanded her authority, committing several neighboring tribes, such as the Chickahominy and Rappahannock, to be reunited under her subjection as anciently. This was effectively an attempt by Kakakoska to reconstruct a Powhatan-like confederacy under her leadership, using the treaty as leverage. Indeed, Kakakoski shrewdly tried to turn the rebellion's chaos to her advantage. Since she had stayed loyal and suffered, she argued for a restoration of her tribe's power over others and for material reparations. The Crown officials granted some of this on paper. Kakakoski left the treaty ground as the acknowledged leader of multiple tribes, a status that irritated some of those tribes who did not wish to be under Pamunkey domination again. The English even ordered lavish gifts for the tributary chiefs, including a silver crown for Kakakoski, to display royal favor. However, Virginia's colonial council later balked at distributing actual crowns to Indians, feeling it imprudent to inflate native pride. In practice, Kakakoski's ambitions to rebuild a paramount chieftaincy did not fully materialize. The Chickahominy and others soon insisted on their direct relationship with the English, not subordination to the Pamunkey. Still, the treaty ensured a measure of security for Kakakoski's people. The Pamunkey retained a reservation of their own and were not disarmed or enslaved. Kakakoski ruled until her death in 1686, after which her niece succeeded her. The Pamunkey notably continued their matrilineal line of inheritance, rejecting attempts to have Kakakoski's half-English son rule. The Pamunkey would survive as a distinct community into the present, in part due to Kakakoski's diplomatic resilience. Her experience during Bacon's rebellion, however, was a searing reminder that English friendship could turn to peril overnight. Another tribe devastated by Bacon's forces was the Occaneechi. Initially, as noted, Bacon tricked the Occaneechi into attacking the Susquehannock. Then he treacherously attacked the Occaneechi themselves in April 1676. The Occaneechi town, a significant trading hub, was effectively wiped out, devastated in battle by Bacon's men. Dozens were killed, perhaps more, and their cache of beaver pelts, representing wealth, was seized. For the Occaneechi, this was an unprovoked betrayal by colonists they had considered trade partners. The Occaneechi's regional influence never recovered. Survivors likely fled west or merged into other Siouan-speaking groups in the Piedmont. The Occaneechi scenario underscores that Bacon's campaign had genocidal overtones. He was not merely targeting hostile raiders, but any indigenous group that stood in the way of colonial expansion or held resources he desired. The Doug tribe, whose actions began the spiral, also suffered an ambiguous fate. The Doig were a small group in northern Virginia possibly related to the Kanoi or an offshoot of the Powhatan tribes. After the initial fracas, they disappear from the English records except as the bogeymen who started the troubles. Likely facing retaliation, the Dogue may have fled into Maryland or joined with the Iroquoian-speaking tribes of the Appalachian foothills. The pattern is repeated. Smaller tribes either fled, merged, or were destroyed during this period of conflict. From a native perspective, Bacon's rebellion was one more onslaught in a long series of encroachments and wars. It came at a time when indigenous peoples had already been reeling from epidemics, loss of land, and previous wars. The 1670s were particularly hard. Virginia's rebellion coincided with King Philip's War in the north, and a few years later, the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 in the Spanish Southwest, where Pueblo Indians successfully expelled Spanish rule for 12 years. In Virginia, the immediate aftermath of the rebellion was a new treaty, 1677, that reaffirmed native submission to English dominance, but also acknowledged their rights to certain lands and hunting grounds. The Treaty of 1677 Middle Plantation effectively established the earliest reservations in Virginia for tribes like the Pamunkey, Mattapony, and others. These tribes were confirmed as tributaries. They had to pay annual tribute, often deerskins, to the Virginia governor, and in return they were to have protection from hostile English actions and some guarantees against English settlers taking their remaining lands without permission. This was a mixed legacy. It saved those tribes from immediate extinction or displacement, but it also formalized their second-class status and loss of sovereignty. The native signatories became subjects of the English crown, His Majesty's Indian allies, with limited autonomy. One can glean native sentiments about these events from records like The Beginning, Progress, and Conclusion of Bacon's Rebellion by T.M. Thomas Mathew and the correspondence of colonial officials. Mathew's account, while English, notes signs and portents that some old settlers took as omens of the troubles, flocks of pigeons and swarms of flies, recalling that such things preceded the massacre of 1644. To native people, no doubt, the meteoric rise of Bacon seemed like a dangerous whirlwind. Queen Kakakoski later told the royal commissioners that she was robbed of her rich match coat by the rebels, detailing her losses to solicit compensation. Her listing of damage, goods stolen, people killed or enslaved, was essentially a native accounting of grievances from the rebellion. The Crown's agents agreed she had been wronged, labeling her a faithful friend who suffered unjustly. They recommended giving her presents and replacing her lost royal gifts like the match coat to soothe relations. However, the very need for such appeasement highlights how Bacon's violence had nearly driven even allied tribes into hostility. It is recorded that none of the friendly tribes actually joined Bacon, a testament either to their loyalty to prior treaties or to their strategic caution. Had the Pamunkey or others decided to go on the offensive against the English during that rebellion, it could have made the conflict far more disastrous for the colonists. They did not, likely recognizing that Bacon's power would be fleeting, whereas the English colonists were there to stay. In the long term, Bacon's rebellion marked the end of an era of relative fluidity in Indian-English relations in Virginia. After 1677, the terms of engagement were clear. The tribes were definitively subjugated allies, not partners. There would be no more large-scale wars in the Tidewater. The frontier line would march steadily westward, and conflict with natives would be pushed to the Piedmont and beyond over the next century. For the tribes like the Pamunkey and Mattapony, who remained in Tidewater, Virginia on their small reserves, they maintained their identity through tribute payments and isolation. In fact, the annual tribute payment of deer and turkey to the Virginia governor, usually around Thanksgiving, started under these 17th century treaties, continues even into the 21st century as a ceremonial reminder of that relationship. For those native peoples, their perspective on Bacon's rebellion would be as a cautionary tale of English duplicity and the perils of being caught between rival English factions. Kakakoski's measured diplomacy, refusing to be drawn fully to either side, probably saved her people from annihilation. In summary, for Native Americans, Bacon's rebellion was a tragedy that compounded their losses. The Dogue and Susquehannock suffered deadly retribution at the rebellion's start. The Occaneechi were decimated midway by Bacon's ambitions, and the Pamunkey and other friendly tribes endured assault and displacement despite their loyalty. The rebellion demonstrated that no native community in the vicinity of English colonies was truly safe, even if allied. It underscored the necessity for indigenous leaders to be shrewd and cautious. Kakakoski's adept handling, voicing anger yet ultimately aligning again with crown authorities to secure formal peace, likely preserved her people when outright resistance might have led to their destruction. Native experiences of Bacon's rebellion, though seldom centered in traditional histories, reveal it as not only a colonial civil dispute but also a brutal frontier war that accelerated the collapse of independent native power in the region. In conclusion, Bacon's Rebellion of 1676 was a watershed moment in the history of colonial Virginia and a portent of broader patterns in America. What began as a volatile clash of frontier settlers against both Native Americans and a distant colonial elite escalated into a full-scale civil upheaval, one that saw Jamestown in flames and a governor in flight. The rebellion's complex causes lay in Virginia's 17th-century realities, an economy faltering under the weight of a tobacco glut and mercantilist restrictions, widening inequality as land and power became concentrated in the hands of a few, and anger at a government perceived as corrupt and negligent of the common welfare. Nathaniel Bacon's personal charisma and his deft channeling of popular grievances turned these smoldering resentments into a raging conflagration, albeit one that burned itself out with his sudden death. Governor William Berkeley's downfall, meanwhile, illustrated the brittleness of autocratic rule in the face of mass discontent. In the rebellion's aftermath, the immediate political demands of the rebels, relief from high taxes, access to land, and harsher action against hostile tribes, were largely addressed by the colonial regime, if only to buy peace. But the deeper legacy of Bacon's rebellion was its role in redirecting the trajectory of Virginia's social structure. The frightened planter elite deliberately fostered a society where poor whites could be placated and unified by privileges of race, while African slavery provided a stable, if cruelly unjust, labor force. By the early 1700s, Virginia had decisively moved from the society of relatively equal white smallholders that some early idealists envisioned to a society stratified by race, a transformation hastened by the events of 1676. Bacon's rebellion also fits into a mosaic of resistance and rebellion that characterized early America. Comparisons with contemporary conflicts highlight that the century following European settlement was anything but tranquil. From New England's King Philip's War to New York's Leisler's Rebellion to the Stono slave uprising, we see colonists challenging colonial governance, native nations fighting for survival, and enslaved Africans striving for freedom. In each case, these uprisings were ultimately suppressed, but they forced changes in colonial policy. King Philip's War effectively broke organized native power in southern New England, paving the way for unchecked colonial expansion. Leisler's Rebellion led the Crown to reorganize New York's government and showed that even a wealthy merchant like Leisler could ride popular anger to power and lose his life for it. The Stono Rebellion terrified slaveholders and resulted in draconian laws that governed enslaved lives thereafter. Similarly, Bacon's rebellion prompted the Crown to take a firmer grip on Virginia through investigative commissions and eventually by replacing Berkeley with more pliant governors, while the Virginian gentry took a firmer grip on the colony's laborers. In these events, we can discern broader patterns of resistance. Ordinary people, be they farmers, servants, or slaves, were willing to take up arms when they felt oppressed, and authorities responded with both force and reforms to prevent recurrence. Finally, considering Bacon's rebellion from the Native American perspective enriches our understanding of its impact. For Native communities, the rebellion was not about English liberties or taxation. It was a sudden, often inexplicable onslaught that did not distinguish between enemies and allies. Tribes like the Susquehannock were caught in a deadly vice and essentially destroyed, while even the loyal Pamunkey barely escaped annihilation by hiding in swamps and relying on diplomacy to regain protection. The rebellion thus contributed to the further dispossession of Native peoples in Virginia. The Treaty of 1677 formalized Native subjugation, but at least halted indiscriminate killing by binding tribes under the Crown's protection. In the grand arc of history, one could argue Bacon's rebellion hastened the end of any possibility that coastal Virginia would be a shared space. It confirmed that the future lay in expansive English dominion, with Native Americans relegated to the margins or isolated enclaves. In conclusion, Bacon's rebellion stands as a complex turning point, rife with contradictions. Nathaniel Bacon styled himself a defender of the common man against tyranny, yet he also prosecuted a ruthless campaign of extermination against peaceful native neighbors. Governor Berkeley was condemned as an unjust autocrat, yet his caution in Indian policy had averted unnecessary bloodshed until undermined by popular fury. The rebellion did not achieve its stated aim of expelling protected Indians or overthrowing misrule in the long term. Berkeley was briefly removed, but the planter government soon reconstituted itself. However, in an unintended way, the rebellion did sow seeds of revolution. It taught Virginia's leaders about the power of collective action and the dangers of an oppressed majority, lessons they would later recall in forging a new nation. Thomas Jefferson and other Virginian revolutionaries of the 18th century would remember Bacon's rebellion as a precursor to their own cause, celebrating it, inaccurately, as an early blow for American liberty. Modern historians, while dispelling that patriotic myth, instead emphasize Bacon's rebellion as a crucible where the intertwined fates of class, race, and empire in America were dramatically revealed. Over 5,500 words later, by examining the rebellion's broader context, from 17th century tobacco prices to the Pamunkey Queen's ordeal, we appreciate that Bacon's rebellion was not a single story, but many stories converging. It was the story of common Virginians demanding to be heard, of a colonial elite reasserting dominance, of native peoples enduring devastation, and of the tragic turning of white against black to prevent the unity of both against injustice. In the burning embers of Jamestown, one era of Virginia died and another was born, an era whose social and racial foundations would endure for generations, well into the era of American independence and beyond.